open your Bibles to 1 Samuel chapter 17. 1 Samuel's in the Old Testament. Beginning in chapter 17, in 1 Samuel, we find Israel and the Philistines gathered for battle. Let me read you some of these verses to set the background of where I'm going tonight with this message. First one reads, "And the Philistines gathered together their armies to battle. And Saul and the men of Israel were gathered together and pitched by the valley of Elah, and set the battle in array against the Philistines." They sized up the battle, in other words. Verse 3, "And the Philistines stood on a mountain on one side, and Israel stood on the mountain on the other side. And there was a valley in between." One side was Israel, and the other side was the Philistines, and a valley in between. "And there went out a champion out of the camp of the Philistines, named Goliath of Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. He was a giant of a man, I'll just leave it at that for now. And he had a helmet of brass upon his head, and he was armed with a coat of mail, and the weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of brass. And he had greaves of brass upon his legs, and a target of brass between his shoulders." Now, most of you already know what this story is about. At least this first story I'm bringing to your attention tonight. It's the David and Goliath story. Verse 7, "The staff of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and his spear's head weighed 600 shekels of iron, and one bearing a shield went before him. And he stood and cried unto the armies of Israel, and said unto them, Why are ye come out to set your battle in array?" Why did you show up? Planning to fight us, in other words, to wage war against us. And how come you're not doing anything about it? He goes on to say, "Am I not a Philistine? And ye servants to Saul?" He was challenging them. "Choose you a man for you, and let him come down to me. If he be able to fight with me and to kill me, then we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then shall ye be our servants and serve us." So whoever wins the fight, send your best guy down, Goliath yells out. "And if I lose, we serve you. If you lose, you serve us." And the Philistines said, "I defy the armies of Israel this day. Give me a man that we might fight together." The enemy always defines the things that God attaches to. It's no different on a personal level. Satan and his evil meanings are not our friends. They're just not even casual acquaintances. They're our fierce enemy that seeks to destroy us, to become his servants. Instead of God's. And the Philistines said, "I defy the armies of Israel this day. Give me a man that we might fight together." When Saul and all Israel heard those words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. They thought there was no one in the camp of Israel's army that could come against Goliath and win. See, their trust was in their own abilities in fighting the enemy. Their trust was not placed in God, that He would fight the battle for them. Sure, they would have to still go out there and face the enemy, but it's the Lord that empowers and brings the victory. Once again, we're just the ambassadors, or in this case, the foot soldiers. They carry out His desire. In the whole camp of Israel's army, not one single person, not one, trusted God. Not a single person. This is not like a small group of 6 or 12 or 24 or even 100. This was a large group of people gathered together to come against the Philistines. And when Goliath appeared on the scene, they all became instant cowards. They probably were even afraid of Goliath's shadow. They were dismayed and greatly afraid. I'm not passing judgment on these people. The story tells itself. Too many people react by saying, if I was there, I wouldn't have acted that way. I would have trusted God. Don't be too sure. Flesh and blood has a way of taking over your senses and blind you to what you already know to be true, but yet you're afraid to act upon it. Maybe you would, and maybe you wouldn't. But not a single person stepped up and say, you ain't defy my God. I come against you in the name of the Lord. Not a single person. Not even one. The odds, you can't even put odds because now nobody there that would step up. In this period of time where it was necessary, including the king, by the way, the hotshot king, who everybody respected, in a sense was in awe of him, that were part of the Israel army, but yet he didn't offer himself. Let's move along. Verse 16. I'll skip through this story. You can read the whole story yourself on your own time, but I want to make sure I get through this whole message tonight. And the Philistine drew near, Goliath once again, morning and evening, and presented himself 40 days. 40 days this went on. Think about it. The laughing and mockery that was taking place in the Philistines' army. Thinking that they had the upper hand now. I'm sure of that. Now, I don't know why they didn't attack the Israelis. Maybe they're enjoying it too much, watching them just cower in fear. At this point, I believe if they did attack, and probably God had something to do with why they didn't attack at this point, because someone would come on the scene, David, that would come against Goliath. And that's probably God's plan all along. And he held back the Philistines without them even knowing it. But 40 days goes by. Not one person in Israel's army, including the king, said, "Enough's enough." You will not insult. You will not mock the Lord of Israel, the God of Israel, any longer. Even if it means if I die, I die. But I'm going to step up and claim what Gideon claimed when he was faced with impossible odds. Let's continue. Verse 20. And David rose up early in the morning and left the sheep with the keeper and took and went as Jesse commanded him. Now Jesse is David's father. He had brothers in the army, which they didn't step up, by the way. So even though Samuel was confused when he anointed David earlier in the book of Samuel, God was not confused. He knew who he chose. In chapter 16 in 1 Samuel, you can read where Samuel anoints David king, even though he wouldn't become king until years later. And David rose up early in the morning and left the sheep with the keeper and took and went as Jesse had commanded him. And he came to the trench as the host was going forth to fight and shout for the battle. Once again, a lot of yelling back and forth, but no one's really fighting yet. And David left his carriage, verse 22, in the hand of the keeper of the carriage, and ran into the army, and came and saluted his brethren. And as he talked with them, behold, there came up the champion, the Philistine of Gath, Goliath by name, out of the armies of the Philistine. I almost see God saying, okay, I'm going to pull you by the string, Goliath, at the right time, because now David's here. And I know he will respond. And not cower down in fear and bow down and run or whatever the rest of the Israeli army were doing. David would stand up in the name of the Lord against this uncircumcised Philistine. And as he talked with them, behold, there came up the champion, the Philistine of Gath, Goliath by name, out of the armies of the Philistines, and spake according to the same works as David heard them. And all the men of Israel, when they saw the man, fled from him and were so afraid. And the men of Israel said, have you seen this man that is come up? Surely to defy Israel he is come up. And it shall be that a man who killeth him, the king, will enrich him with great riches, and will give him his daughter, and make his father's house free in Israel. They're trying to probably talk each other into, okay, who's gonna sign up? Who's gonna volunteer? And not who's gonna volunteer in the name of the Lord to go fight this Philistine. No. We can't convince ourselves to go find him, but you know what? The king obviously said that whoever killed this Philistine, he will give him riches. And he will give him his daughter, and make his father's house free in Israel. So the reward was sent out, obviously in the camp of the Israelites. And no one still responded. You go first. No, you go first. No one went first. And David spake to the men that stood by him, saying, what shall be done to the man that killeth this Philistine, and taketh away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine, that he should defy the armies of the living God? And the people answered him after the manner, saying, so shall it be done to the man that killeth him. And then, of course, his brothers heard David's response. And his brothers get on his case. To make a long story short, and some heard what David said, and said that they went to tell Saul what David was saying. So they brought David to Saul in verse 32, and David said to Saul, "Let no man's heart fail because of him. Thy servant will go and fight with this Philistine." And here is where I want you to take note. Write this down. As a shepherd boy, because that's what he still was here, even though he was anointed to be king, and he would have become king for years later, he was still acting as a shepherd boy for his father and the family. As a shepherd boy, his faith and dependence was in God. Remember that. He knew the battle was not his, but the Lord's. Let no man's heart fail because of him. Thy servant will go and fight with this Philistine. And Saul said to David, "Thou art not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for thou art just but a youth, and he a man of war from his youth." And David explains that he fought a bear in one, he fought a lion in one, he slew both the lion and the bear. And this uncircumcised, in verse 36, Philistine shall be as one of them, seeing he hath defied the armies of the living God. Shepherd boy faith. Shepherd boy trust in his God. At this point of his life. So Saul obviously had no other choice, so he sends David into the battle. He tried to put his own battle armor on him and didn't fit, so David said, "This is untested." He would not wear it. He chooses 5 smooth stones. He only needed 1. He kills Goliath. And the rest is history. Now, go to 1 Chronicles. But I want to remind you, as I have written in my Bible here, in this story, at this point of his life, as a shepherd boy, his faith and dependence was in God. He knew the battle was the Lord's. Now go to 1 Chronicles, chapter 21. Let's leave that story and go to a different story. Much later in his life, toward the end of his kingship, David takes a census. And we'll start with verse 1. And Satan stood up against Israel. Personalize it for yourself tonight. And provoked David to number Israel. Let me tell you something right now, friends. If you're trusting the Lord, and if you're actively participating in the cause of Christ, Satan and his minions are going to stand up against you. And they're going to do everything to provoke you to do something that David did here. And I'll get to that in a minute. And David said to Joab and to the rulers of the people, "Go number Israel from Beersheba even to Dan, and bring the number of them to me, that I may know it." And Joab answered, "The Lord make his people 100 times so many more as they be. But my lord the king, are they not all my lord's servants? Why then doeth my lord require this thing? Why will he be a cause of trespass to Israel?" See, Joab knew better. He says, "Why in the world are you doing this, David? Why are you taking a census? They all will do whatever you tell them to do. So why number them?" Nevertheless, the king's word prevailed against Joab, whereat Joab departed and went throughout all Israel and came to Jerusalem. And Joab gave the sum of the number of the people unto David, and all they of Israel were 1,100,000 men that drew sword. And Judah was 460 men that drew sword. But Levi and Benjamin counted he not among them, for the king's word was abominable to Joab. Now, what's the differences of the first story I just read, where David as a shepherd boy came against Goliath in the name of the Lord? Who was this uncircumcised Philistines who defied the armies of the living God? And now, much later in his life, he takes a census. Others knew it was wrong. But he sought to know how mighty and strong his forces were. Now, he was not displeased, he being God, as some will preach, because he took a census. Moses took census. In fact, if you go back to the history of Moses, he took 2 censuses, not just 1 but 2. God didn't get upset with him back then. So why would he get upset with him taking a census now? Because the reason why the census was taken was totally different than the reason why Moses took those censuses. What do you mean by that? David wanted to know how strong and mighty his army was. So what's wrong with that? Well, it demonstrates here in this story that David was leaning more on himself and what he has gathered as an army to come against any possible foe than on God. Just think how ecstatic Satan was when David went down this journey. Personalize it. Just think how ecstatic he gets when we, as proclaiming Christians, start putting more of our trust in what we have accomplished, what we have accumulated, than in God. He was not displeased, I repeat, because of the census. He was displeased because David no longer was delighting in the Lord. What do you mean by that? Go to Jeremiah quickly. I'm running out of time. Go to Jeremiah chapter 9. Verse 23. Jeremiah 9:23 reads, "Thus say the Lord, let the wise man not glory in his wisdom." Wisdom's okay translation. In fact, you should include that in the translation when defining this Hebrew word. But you also have to add, let not wise men glory in his skills. So write that down. And also add, let no man wise glory in his experiences. When you start glorying in your own wisdom, you start acting like you know better than God. So you don't even consult in prayer about anything that you might face to the Lord. You start leaving him out, or you just briefly maybe tell him what the prayer request is, but you already have a predetermined solution in your mind because you know better. This is the things that displease the Lord. This is what happened to David, my friend. What else does it say? Thus say the Lord, let not the wise man glory in his own skills. Some of you, and I include myself in that, in all these definitions. We all have to be cautious and on the lookout for Satan's strategies to lead us down this route where we lean more on our wisdom and our skills, our experiences, than leaning on God to get us through, to lead us, to guide us, to help us finish this journey, fighting the good fight of faith as Paul did in the New Testament. Let not the wise man glory in his skills, your talents, your ability to get things done. Let not the wise man glory in his experiences. Of course, as you grow older, as you become more of a mature Christian, you'll gain more and more experiences. To the point where you eventually think you've gained so much experience that you don't even have to consult God anymore because you're going to rely on your past experiences. Let me tell you right now, every time I've done that in my personal journey with the Lord, I found out that I didn't know as much as I thought I did, because this new experience is nothing like the other experiences. It might be similar, it might have some characteristics that are the same, but there's always a little twist to it. That is different. Let not the wise man glory in his wisdom, neither let the mighty, and David thought he was mighty at that point. At this point, pretty much all his adversaries were a thing of the past. And let not the rich man glory in his riches. Wisdom and all the different other definitions for it. Glory there is boast or to shine. In other words, to show off what you think you know. And of course, the wealth that you might accumulate. And not might be in rich as far as material things, but you might think it's a wealth of information. But let him that glorieth glory this, that he understandeth and knoweth me. Understand and know God, that I am the Lord which exercise loving kindness. In the Hebrew it's mercy and some other words in the definition, but let's just stay with loving kindness and mercy. Judgment, he knows how to deliver judgment. And righteousness in the earth, for in these things I delight, saith the Lord. I delight what I can provide. I don't and how you trust in me to provide those things to you. I don't delight in your own wisdom. I don't delight in your boasting of yourself. And I sure don't delight in your riches. I delight in the way I exercise my mercy and loving kindness. I delight in the way I can deliver judgment better than anything you can ever figure out. What you think is fair and deserving or undeserving. And righteousness, well, with Jesus Christ. I can't see any Christian ever thinking that they could develop a righteousness that supersedes what he did. That self-made righteousness that's straight from the pit of hell, if you think you can. In the earth, for in these things I delight, saith the Lord. I repeat, he was not displeased with David because of the senses. He was displeased because he was not delighting in the Lord. What was David at that census moment, census taking moment, delighting in? He was delighting in his own might. I haven't seen any case in the scriptures or personal experiences of relationships that I've had over the years where when you find yourself delighting in your own might, delighting in your own wisdom, delighting in your own skills, experiences, and not leaning on God, where it does not lead to a sin of unbelief. Because when you start trusting in those things and not trusting God, that's where it leads to, my friend. Even today, Satan is trying anything that he can to put our trust in armies, money, anything but God. And here in 1 Chronicles chapter 21, David was putting his trust in numbers, but not the Lord. It's a terrible place to find yourself in, my friends. Whether it's numbers, wisdom, riches, glory, those are all things that do not delight the Lord. So what's the takeaway from these two stories tonight? Where would you like to find yourself in your own personal walk with Christ? The second story or the first story? The second story, David was trusting in what he was able to accumulate. What he thought was by his own efforts. The first story is where we need to be. We need to be more like the shepherd, not the king, when comparing these two stories. You got it? I repeat, we need to be more like the shepherd that faced Goliath than the king that took the census. One puts their complete trust in God in all aspects of their life. The other, just the opposite. This is where Satan and his minions want you to be, in that opposite stage, not in that shepherd boy stage of life. The book of Revelation says, you lost your first love. And usually when you use your first love, means you start following things back of the flesh. And the flesh always leads to desires and the so-called wisdom that you think you've now accumulated, where you have enough of your life in control and God's not so much necessary any longer, needed to guide you and direct you and to cause you to grow. What I'm trying to say is, to myself first and to anyone that the shoe fits, you're not that much of a hotshot as you think you are. I don't want to be a hotshot. I want the Lord to remember me that I seek in the things of God that delights Him, not things that delights this world or anything that I can gain by it that caters to my flesh. God grant me the ability in my discipleship journey to always remember what David was like as a shepherd boy when facing Goliath. And I pray daily that I and you don't fall in the trap that Satan wants us to be more like the king that took the census. Without faith, it's impossible to please God. That means you're putting your trust and faith and confidence in His Son. There's no denying it. Without the Son, we're nothing. We are lost, with no hope. I said to someone, there's plenty of drug dealers around. Well, we're hope dealers. We're delivering hope to the lost. And that's why in this year of 2019, I want to expand and I want to get the word out. Of whom we should put our trust and confidence in. So let's all start being more like the shepherd boy and leaving that king that took the census behind and pressing towards the mark where God wants us to be. A place where He's delighted and how we have put our trust and confidence in Him. You got it? If you do, I want to hear from you. Play a song.